Europe divided. NATO fall. NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. Czechoslovakia was not the only country to feel the Soviet pressure in the late 1940s. The USSR tightened its grip on all of its satellite nations, or countries under one nation's control. As political divisions increased tensions in Europe, the superpowers also formed two new military alliances. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. NATO's founding European members were France, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, Iceland, Italy, Britain, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey joined in 1952, and West Germany followed in 1955. NATO members pledged to consider an attack on any member as an attack on all, and formed a standing army to defend Western Europe from a Soviet invasion. The United States played a key role in creating NATO's stability, providing money, troops, and leadership. Through its alliance, the United States took another step away from its old isolationist policies. NATO's establishment prompted the Soviet Union to form its own security alliance in 1955. Under the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania united for their mutual defense. NATO and Warsaw members began to see each other as enemies, formally dividing Europe into two armed camps. By 1955, two military alliances, Warsaw Pact and NATO, had further divided Europe. On one side were the Soviet-backed states of Eastern Europe, on the other were the non-communist states of Western Europe. Hungary tests the limits of containment. Not long after the signing of the Warsaw Pact, upheaval in Hungary tested the West's anti-communist resolve. In October of 1956, thousands of Hungarians took part in a brief revolt against the communist government. The protesters marched through the streets of Hungary's capital, Budapest, waving flags and calling for democracy. The leaders of the revolt formed a government led by the Imre Nagy, a reform-minded communist. He aimed to free Hungary from the Soviet domination. He boldly declared that Hungary would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and become a neutral country, and he appealed to Western nations to help stave off Soviet aggression. In a speech to the Hungarian people, he said, "This fight is the fight of freedom against the Russian intervention, and it's possible that I shall only be able to stay at my post for 1 or 2 hours. The whole world will see how the Russian armed forces, contrary to all treaties and conventions, are crushing the resistance of the Hungarian people. Today it is Hungary, and tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, it will be the turn of other countries because the imperialism of Moscow does not know borders." Imre Nagy, November 4th, 1956. Soviet leaders moved swiftly to crush the revolt. Tanks rolled into Budapest along with the Red Army troops. After killing thousands of protesters, the troops put Soviet-backed Hungarian leaders back into power. Nagy stood trial before the country's communist government, which put him to death. The Hungarian people had counted on help from the United States before the revolt. Many felt speakers urged residents to resist the spread of communism. Through these programs, Hungarians learned of the Eisenhower administration's goal of freeing captive peoples. Many Hungarians believed that the United States would support its bid for independence. By sending troops and weapons to aid their fight against the Soviet Union. They were shocked when American forces failed to come. One Hungarian recalled, "People had been watching from rooftops, hoping to see U.S. planes arriving. Eisenhower, however, was unwilling to risk war with the Soviet Union to free one of its satellites." Choosing sides, the Cold War turns hot in Asia. The superpowers did not simply confine their rivalry to Europe. Before long, Cold War conflicts were erupting around the globe. Asia was one of the first affected regions outside of Europe. By the 1950s, both China and Korea had become arenas in the ongoing Cold War struggle. The fall of China to communism. During World War II, Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong and the nationalists who supported Chiang Kai-shek had joined together to fight against Japanese aggression. After Japan's surrender in 1945, however, the two groups turned on each other and waged a civil war for control of China. The United States backed the nationalist even though Chiang was a popular leader. At times, both his allies and his adversaries referred to him as corrupt or ineffective. In 1949, the Communists defeated the nationalists. Chiang and his followers fled to Formosa, an island off the coast of China which they renamed Taiwan. There, Chiang led a small group of nationalist resistance against communism. The fall of China to the Communists ended U.S. hopes that the country would become a powerful non-Communist ally in Asia. Some American lawmakers were angry about such a negative outcome and looked for a scapegoat to blame. In public speeches and on the floor of Congress, a bitter question was asked: who lost China? Some Republican leaders pointed accusatory fingers at President Truman. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson denied that the administration was responsible for the establishment of a communist government in China. Nothing this country did or could have done within reasonable limits of its capabilities, he said, could have changed the result. Many China scholars agreed, noting the unpopularity of Chiang and the broad public support for Mao Zedong. Many U.S. leaders feared that China and the Soviet Union would form an alliance and pose an even greater threat to American interests around the world. Most Americans viewed Communist China as similar to the Soviet Union, both in its attitude towards the West and its desire to spread communism around the world. Although China did remain a key ally of the Soviet Union for years, it also pursued its own interests and rejected Soviet control. The communist victory in China prompted the United States to seek a new ally in Asia and Japan. And Japan was the logical choice. The United States gradually lifted restrictions on industrial and economic growth imposed on Japan after World War II. Eventually, Japan became an economic powerhouse and a strong U.S. partner in the region. Containment by isolation. The U.S. ends relations with China. When Mao Zedong, formerly the People's Republic of China, in 1949, the United States adopted a stern policy toward the Asian nation. The United States continued to refer to nationalists in Taiwan as China's legitimate government instead of recognizing Mao's new state. American trade with China was also suspended, and the U.S. government opposed China's admission to the United Nations. These actions were taken with one goal in mind: to contain China by isolating it from the global community. Not all American officials favored this tough policy, however. Some felt that improving U.S. relations with China might weaken China's ties with the Soviet Union, but U.S. officials faced strong pressure from Congress and the public to treat China as an enemy. Many Americans felt that Mao and Stalin were equally reprehensible. Forging a better relationship with either one seemed an unthinkable option. Until the 1970s, the United States continued to recognize Taiwan and bar China from the UN. Formal diplomatic relations between the United States and China did not resume until 1979. Containment by armed force, the Korean War. Like China, Korea was able to break free from Japanese control when World War II ended. At that time, Soviet troops occupied the Korean peninsula north of the 38th parallel, while the U.S. military held the area to the south. In the north, the Soviet Union put up a pro-Soviet communist government in power. In the South, the United States supported an existing anti-communist government. However, the arrangement masked deep tensions that existed on the peninsula. These tensions erupted into full-blown conflict in June of 1950 with the start of the Korean War. The war began when North Korean troops armed with Soviet weapons invaded South Korea. Their aim was to unite all of Korea under communist rule. Truman, viewing the invasion as a test of American will, ordered U.S. forces to help South Korea repel the invaders. Truman turned to the United Nations for support. A UN resolution condemned the North Korean invasion and called on member states to aid South Korea. Troops from 15 nations joined the UN forces, with the vast majority of the soldiers coming from the United States. According to another UN resolution, the purpose of this joint force was to create a unified, independent, and democratic Korea. Officials selected American General Douglas MacArthur to lead the troops. Under his command, the army invaded North Korea and fought its way northward, nearly reaching the Chinese border along the Yalu River. Alarmed by the approach of the UN forces, China sent tens of thousands of soldiers streaming over the border into North Korea. A combined army of 400,000 Chinese and North Korean troops forced the UN forces back to the 38th parallel. General MacArthur then called for an expansion of the conflict. He wanted to blockade China's ports and bomb major Chinese industrial centers. President Truman rejected MacArthur's plan. In fact, once China entered the conflict, Truman began looking for a way to resolve it. He feared that the beginning of another global war, but MacArthur would not back down. In an angry letter to a friend, he wrote, "I believe we should defend every place from communism. I don't admit that we can't hold communism wherever it shows its head." When MacArthur publicly questioned the president's decision, Truman fired him. The final 2 years of the war became a stalemate, with most of the fighting happening near the 38th parallel. Finally, in 1953, the two sides signed an armistice that ended hostilities. The agreement left the Korean peninsula divided along the 38th parallel and created a buffer called the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, between the two countries. No military forces from either North Korea or South Korea were allowed to enter the DMZ. The war left all of Korea in shambles. Homes, factories, roads, hospitals, and schools were destroyed throughout the peninsula. About 3.5 million North Korean and South Korean soldiers died or suffered injuries. As many as 2 million Korean civilians may have lost their lives. More than 54,000 American soldiers also perished in the war. North Korea turned inwards after the war's end and became a nation that increasingly isolated itself from the rest of the world. South Korea, in contrast, continued to develop strong economic and political ties with the United States. In time, South Korea's economy flourished. As the economic gap between the two Koreas widened, hopes for a unified, independent, and democratic Korea faded away. Fighting the Cold War in other parts of the world. Fighting the Cold War in other parts of the world. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had effectively divided the world into three groups of nations. One group became known as the First World, or the West. This included developed capitalist countries, the United States, Canada, the nations of Western Europe, and Japan. Another group, the Second World, or the East, consisted of communist countries, the Soviet Union, nations of Eastern Europe, and China. Poor developed nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia made up the final group called the Third World. Many Third World nations had recently gained freedom from colonial rule. The United States and the Soviet Union competed to win their support. Some of the countries aligned themselves with one of the superpowers. Others, such as India, remained independent and non-aligned. United States Information Agency, influencing hearts and minds. Nations used words and persuasion as weapons during the Cold War. Both superpowers utilized propaganda to gain influence over their allies and to persuade others to agree with their point of view. The United States designed its propaganda to raise fears of communism and highlight the benefits of capitalist democracy. This propaganda took many forms, from books and news articles to films and radio broadcasts. To carry out this war of words, the government created the United States Information Agency, or USIA, in 1953. One of USIA's main tasks was to beam radio broadcasts into nations controlled by the Soviet, known collectively as the Soviet bloc. USIA used three networks to carry out its mission: Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. The CIA funded two of the three networks. Radio Free Europe broadcast to Eastern Europe in Czech, Polish, and other languages. Radio Liberty broadcast to the Soviet Union and Russian. Many of the staff members of these services had fled Eastern Europe to escape communist rule. The families they left behind often received harsh treatment from communist governments due to their ties to relatives their relatives had to these radio networks. Soviet and Eastern European leaders tried to restrict their citizens from hearing Western news and ideas by banning radio programs from the West. Broadcasts were disrupted by jamming the signals and filling the airwaves with mechanical shrieks, howls, and other loud noises. Foreign aid, supporting friendly governments. Foreign aid was another Cold War weapon. Both the United States and the Soviet Union gave money and assistance to other countries that became their allies. Some U.S. aid helped the poor by providing funds for agriculture, healthcare, and other social and economic programs. However, much of it took the form of military assistance to friendly Third World governments. Pro-American independent nations often did not. In some countries, such as Nicaragua and Haiti, the United States supported anti-communist dictators. These leaders frequently used the aid to tighten their grip on power, often at the expense of their people. Many citizens in these countries bitterly resented the aid, which seemed to contradict the U.S. goal of promoting democracy. These leaders frequently use the aid to tighten their grip on power, often at the expense of their people. Many citizens in those countries bitterly resented the aid, which seemed to contradict the U.S. goal of democracy. The United States also withheld aid to punish nations that failed to support its policies. In the 1950s, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdul Nasser began building trade ties with the communist nations. In 1956, Egypt bought tanks and other weapons from communist Czechoslovakia in defiance of U.S. wishes. The United States and Britain then withdrew their offers to help Egypt finance the construction of a much-needed Aswan Dam on the Nile River. Nasser retaliated by seizing control of the Suez Canal from the British. This led Britain, France, and Israel to invade Egypt in hope of regaining control of the canal. The Soviet Union then threatened to assist Egypt with military forces. To prevent war, the United States stepped in and persuaded all sides to withdraw, ending the crisis. The CIA containing communism through covert action. In the 1950s, the CIA played a growing part in the Cold War. During this period, the agency expanded its role from intelligence gathering to covert action. Covert action is a secret political, economic, or military operation that supports foreign policy. Agents try to shape events or influence affairs in foreign countries while hiding their actual role in causing those events to happen. During the Cold War, both superpowers used spies, satellite photography, wiretapping, and other covert methods to gather information about or influence events in other countries. Francis Gary Powers' U-2 flight was a covert CIA operation. At times, CIA agents also bribed foreign leaders, supported political parties, or funded supposedly independent radio stations. The United States often used covert action to overthrow unfriendly or leftist governments. In 1953, it helped topple Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's premier. Mossadegh had nationalized a British oil company, establishing government control over a formerly private company, and hinted he might seek Soviet aid. CIA agents worked with Iran's military leaders to overthrow Mossadegh and reinstate the Iranian monarch. Shah Ahmed Reza Pahlavi, an absolute ruler with close U.S. ties, the Shah ruled Iran for almost 30 years. In Central America, the United States also relied on covert action to achieve its goals. In 1954, in Guatemala, for example, the CIA helped overthrow the elected president Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Both U.S. economic interests and Cold War concerns motivated this action. United Fruit Company, a U.S. firm with operations in Guatemala, opposed certain social reforms outlined by the Guatemalan government. In particular, United Fruit objected to a government plan to hand over thousands of acres of company land to the country's landless peasants. Concerned that Guatemala might turn communist, the United States ordered the CIA to support a military coup. Arbenz was overthrown, and a military government took power. It returned United Fruit lands, shelved other reforms, and jailed many of its critics. The role that the U.S. government played in influencing events in Guatemala caused many Latin Americans to view the United States as an enemy of social reform. Sometimes American intervention tactics were extremely aggressive. In 1962, Dominican Republic workers elected non-communist reformer Juan Bosch as president. 7 months after taking office, he was toppled by a military coup. In 1965, Bosch's supporters began a civil war to return him to power. Fearing that he was mainly supported by communists, the United States sent troops to crush the revolt and keep Bosch from retaining control. An arms race threatens global destruction. On September 23, 1949, President Truman made a grim announcement. "We have evidence," he said, "that within recent weeks an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR." The statement alarmed Americans. Previously, only the United States had possessed an atomic bomb. Now that the Soviet Union had one as well, the United States felt the need to develop weapons that had even greater destructive force. Soon, the two superpowers were locked in a deadly arms race, or competition to achieve weapon superiority. The race to develop weapons of mass destruction. Shortly after the Soviet atomic test, American scientists began discussing plans for a new type of bomb. It would be based not on splitting atoms, the technology used for the atomic bomb, but on fusing them, known as the hydrogen bomb. or H-bomb, this weapon would be far more powerful than an atomic bomb. Some scientists, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, argued against it. In a report from the Atomic Energy Commission, these experts warned that the H-bomb was not a weapon which can be used exclusively for military purposes, since it would have far greater effect on civilian populations than the result of an atomic bomb. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's top military leaders, disagreed with these members of the scientific community. The United States, the Joint Chiefs said, would be in intolerable position if a possible enemy possessed the bomb and the United States did not. When other scientists and Truman advisors sided with the generals, Truman gave the green light for producing the hydrogen bomb. In 1952, the United States tested its first H-bomb. It was smaller than the atomic bombs that had been dropped on Japan during World War II, but this new weapon was 500 times more powerful. A year later, the Soviet Union tested its own H-bomb. A witness at the Soviet test site recalled how the earth trembled beneath us, and our faces were struck like the lash of a whip. From the jolt of the shock wave, it was difficult to stand on one's feet. Day was replaced with night. By 1960, the arms race had led to the development of nuclear missiles and submarines. First, the United States and the Soviet Union built long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which could deliver nuclear warheads to distant continents. Next, the United States developed nuclear-powered submarines that could launch up to 16 nuclear missiles from the water. The Soviet Union soon followed with its own nuclear submarines. With these advanced capabilities, citizens of both nations now knew that enemy warheads could one day rain destruction down on their cities from far away. Brinkmanship, using the threat of war to contain communism. The threat of nuclear war carried the prospect of utter annihilation, and the United States tried to use this threat to its advantage. In the 1950s, the government developed a foreign policy known as brinkmanship, or willingness to go to the edge or brink of war. Brinkmanship was based on a simple, if dangerous, idea. According to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the Soviets had to believe that the United States would use its nuclear weapons if it was pushed too far. In a speech, Dulles declared, "You have to take chances for peace, just as you have to take chances in war. The ability to get to the verge without actually getting into war is the necessary art. If you are scared to go to the brink of war, you are lost." To its critics, brinkmanship seemed foolhardy. It implied that the Soviets only understood force and assumed that they would back down if they were faced with the prospect of nuclear war. Even so, Dulles believed that the United States had to be ready to go to war to keep the peace. A growing conflict in Asia soon tested this policy. In China, both communists on the mainland and nationalists in Taiwan claimed to be the nation's legitimate rulers. In 1954, Mao decided to assert China's claim to Taiwan and ordered his troops to fire on the nearby islands of Quemoy and Matsu. The nationalist government claimed these islands and feared their loss to communists would lead to an invasion of Taiwan. Eisenhower saw the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu as a challenge to American influence in Asia. As a result, the United States signed a treaty with the nationalist government and pledged to protect Taiwan in case of attack. 3 years later, China resumed its assault on the islands. This time, the United States threatened to launch a nuclear attack on China. This warning caused the Chinese government to back down. In the eyes of the United States, China's decision proved that brinkmanship could be a successful policy. Deterring attack by threatening mutually assured destruction. As the threat of nuclear war lingered over the world, Dulles developed a new strategy to reinforce brinkmanship and ensure American nuclear superiority. The strategy, called deterrence, focused on developing a stockpile of weapons considered so deadly that the Soviet Union would not dare to attack the United States. Dulles also believed that warning the Soviets that the attack would be met with an even deadlier U.S. counterattack would reduce the threat of war as well. The combination of deterrence and each nation's willingness to use nuclear weapons came to be known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It meant that either side would respond to a nuclear attack by launching its own missiles, and each country would suffer devastating results. Fear of a nuclear conflict made the United States and the Soviet Union more likely to step back from all-out war. However, while MAD may have helped prevent the Cold War from turning hot, it also kept the world in a heightened state of anxiety. Berlin Blockade, 1948, blockade, NATO and Warsaw Pact, Korean War, Third World, mutually assured destruction. This has been has been Lesson 39, the Cold War expands. Lesson 39, the Cold War expands. Lesson 39, the Cold War expands.